Welcome, those of you who might not be familiar with the place, to the Institute of Historical Research. This seminar is organised by the Trade Union and Employment Forum of History and Policy, which is an organisation based at the IHR, which puts professional historians in contact with policymakers and tries to get history into the policy process, the political debate. I'm Philip Murphy, I'm Director of History and Policy, and I'm going to be chairing this event this evening. We're going to be talking about first Labour government, the 1924 Ramsay MacDonald government, under the sort of leading question, was it the most working class Labour government ever? And at a time when not just Labour, but the whole political establishment is having to try and kind of reconnect with the broader public and the broader electorate, which is on the whole quite sceptical about the political class in general. Is this something that's important, and does it have, I suppose, lessons for contemporary political organisation? We've got an incredibly rich panel, and so I think we've got the basis of a fascinating discussion tonight. We have Gill Bennett, who is the former Chief Historian of the Foreign Office, and it's a kind of a mark of the way in which the Ramsay MacDonald government became embedded in Labour mythology, that when New Labour won the 1997 general election, the new Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, specifically asked Gill to write a report on the Zinoviev Letter affair. Just a sort of key moment in sort of Labour martyrology. And Gill did a kind of fantastic job, looking into some very obscure intelligence records, producing a pamphlet which became a kind of staple of at least one of my courses for a long time. And then Gill expanded that into a kind of broader book, the Zinoviev Letter, The Conspiracy That Never Dies, published in 2018. Next, I would have David Torrance, who is a historian, biographer, and constitutional specialist at the House of Commons Library. And in particular, he is the author of this fine book, Wild Men, the remarkable story of Britain's first Labour government, which was published in 2024. And David will say something. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people will refer back to David's account. It's such an eye-opener. We have John Cruddas, who was Labour MP representative for Dagenham and Rainham from 2001 to 2024. Served in Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet as policy coordinator. John is an honorary fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, and he also published a book in 2024, A Century of Labour, which he resisted the temptation of calling it From Keir to Keir. But instead it has a sort of photograph of Ramsay MacDonald and Keir Starmer staring pensively, I think, at one another in black and white, and it's also highly recommended. Another biographer, Jim Moher, and one of the members of our Trade Union and Employment Forum. Jim's a former trade union official and author of a very fine biography of Walter Citrine, forgotten statesman of the TUC. And it's thanks to Jim that we have this event this evening. Jim's put a lot of work into organising this, so thanks to him. We have Peter Ackers, who's Emeritus Professor of the history of industrial relations at Loughborough University. And finally, last but not least, we have Tom Wilson, who is a former director of Union Learn. And again, because this is history and policy, we're not only interested in the history itself, but in the lessons that this might have for the labour movement more generally today. So it's great to have Tom on the programme. So if I could ask David just to kick off with a few remarks about however you want to, whichever direction you want to take.
Sure. I was slightly apprehensive because there's no more 2.5 years since I wrote this book, and I have a terrible tendency to forget previous bits of research, but I shall do my best. I came at this book actually quite fresh. The hook, the obvious hook, was the theory of the formation of the first government, which was just over, in fact, almost exactly 2 years ago. It was a centenary. It started off actually as an attempt at doing a fresh biography of Ramsay MacDonald, but in retrospect, I think I wisely ducked that. David Markin's book, I think, still stands the test of time as a very fine, perhaps definitive work. But I think actually in retrospect, it was a benefit that I came to this quite fresh. I'm not from the labour movement. I'm not hostile to the labour movement, but actually as a historian, I generally looked at the Conservative Party or Scottish nationalists. I dipped into labour, but it really wasn't my forte. But given the baggage which I became aware of as I delved in, as I say, I think it was good that I was able to come at it on a strictly sort of empirical basis, if you like. I was also vaguely conscious the first Labour government had a bad press. It had also been caricatured. Even sympathetic historians, including Gordon Brown, had a tendency to write it off. They would boil it down to John Wheatley and the Housing Act as if it had achieved almost nothing else, which, as I'll return to, I think is unfair. The formation of the first government traumatized Ramsay MacDonald. He records in his diary how traumatic he found it. I don't think he ever really enjoyed cabinet making. Ironically, he disliked intensely coalitions, and indeed the suggestion of a coalition appalled him. But the first Labour government was, in essence, a coalition. It was not only quite a skillfully assembled combination of different aspects of the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, but it also included active and former Liberals, most notably Lord Haldane as Lord Chancellor, and my favourite, a couple of Conservatives. The two Scottish law officers were Unionists or Conservatives. The practical reason for that being that there were no Labour-supporting members of the Scottish Bar. Custom at that point was you had to be a member of the bar, and this provoked some hostility from the Clydesiders within that coalition. Was it the most working class Labour government ever? I think it probably was, although not all of the cabinet were working class. A healthy proportion of them were. And the point within the context of 1924 was that considerably more were working class than had ever been the case before. I mean, I think you had a couple of token Labour working class appointments during the First World War and the coalition governments at that time. But voters, and indeed the political establishment in 1924, were simply not used to the sight of working class people who dressed in a working class way. And indeed there was much commentary from the media at the time about clothing, hats, even the sort of vehicles they turned up in at Downing Street and at Buckingham Palace. And that emphasises the fact that a working class government, even a partly working class government, was an extreme novelty in the context of the 1920s, a country which was used to aristocratic Liberal governments or aristocratic Tory governments. Although I suppose it's important to say that within the Conservative Party, perhaps more than the Liberals, there was an increasing shift towards the middle classes. So Stanley Baldwin is more recognisably middle class than aristocratic. The manifesto, I think it's fair to say, was thin. Indeed, manifestos generally in the 1920s were not the detailed documents we've become accustomed to. Of course, the Labour Party had not expected to win power even as a minority government at that point. I think Sidney Webb had mapped it out to take place in the later 1920s or in the 30s. So they were caught unaware, and in certain respects, the policy agenda was underdeveloped. In the realm of foreign affairs, where Ramsay MacDonald had significant experience and credibility, the manifesto was more fully formed, and perhaps it's no accident that the successes of the first Labour government, I think, are more in that sphere. They're more international than domestic. And of course, the government was in a tremendously weak position. It had neither of the things that most governments, including this one, take for granted, which is a working majority and therefore more or less complete control of the agenda in Parliament. The government controls the legislative agenda. They were faced by not one but two opposition parties, given that curious split in numbers following the 1923 general election. Both the Unionists or Conservatives and the Liberals were major forces, and Ramsay MacDonald was acutely aware that at any point, if those two parties combined and wanted to bring down the government, they could do that, as indeed they did in September, October 1924. Nevertheless, I think, as I said at the start, that government's been given a bad press. If you look at the record across just 9 months, there are some significant achievements. First, council housing, which has had the most commentary, as I said, in foreign affairs, and also modestly progressive advances, I think, in terms of education, unemployment benefit, welfare, and so on. And they undeniably brought a more relentless, more class-based progressive focus to the policy-making agenda, which is not unimportant. However, this also gave rise to what became very familiar tensions within both the government and within the broader Labour movement. It's one thing to be in opposition, where you can of course be much more purist and consistent. It's altogether different being in government, especially as a minority government. So within weeks of the government being formed, you see unhappiness on the trade union wing. Ernest Bevin infuriates Ramsay MacDonald by threatening a London-wide transport strike. MacDonald's modus operandi is credibility. He has in mind Churchill's famous comment from the early 20s that Labour are not fit to govern. If Ramsay's got one aim in mind, it's to prove Churchill wrong on that, and by and large, I think he did. But of course, that involves compromises between demands of the movement, in particular the Red Clydesiders at that time, and the necessary compromises of being in government. And that tension, the trade-offs involved in that would of course be familiar not only to Clement Attlee, but certainly to Harold Wilson and all of his successors, and certainly to Sir Keir Starmer. What of the government's broader record? As I say, the aim was to prove fitness to govern, even though the government ended in pretty tawdry circumstances. It was assaulted from all directions by a sort of cash for honours scandal. This is the implication that Ramsay MacDonald was giving out baronetcies to his biscuit manufacturing friends. There was the Campbell case, where there was an implication of unconstitutional government interference in due legal process. And of course, after the event, after the dissolution of Parliament, you have the Zinoviev Letter. But despite it all, the pregnant sort of cephalological fact is that the Labour government lost that election, and they lost a few dozen seats, but they gained 1 million votes. So the crucial takeaway from the first Labour government is that realignment. The Liberal Party was already in decline, but the 1924 election confirmed that henceforth, and indeed at least for the moment in this Parliament, it remains the case that the main battle lines are between the Conservatives on the right and Labour on the progressive left. And that, I think, is the single most important achievement of that government, proving fitness to govern, realigning British parliamentary politics. And although the future Labour governments and the Labour Party likes to pretend that first government didn't happen. Certainly the second government didn't happen. Without that first Labour government, without the tremendous authority that Ramsay MacDonald carried as Prime Minister and Labour leader, I think the next century of Labour history would have looked very different.
Thank you very much indeed. John.
Okay, thanks, Philip. You asked us to suggest some of the contemporary links to the historical story we talked today, and I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, which is if you look around at the modern world, the rise of Christian nationalism or ethno-nationalist political movements rooted in different conceptions of what is sacred rather than what is just. And I find that very interesting in terms of, you know, Tommy Robinson or certain BJP Hindu nationalism or what's happening in the Muslim community, etc. And it begs the question about what other types of progressive religious contributions have contributed to radical social change within our history. You can go back to the abolitionist cause of the late 18th century, 19th century, rooted within, pioneered by Quakers, later picked up by Anglicans and evangelical reformers. You can go to the Factory Acts of the early 19th century. Again, evangelicals, Methodists, Quakers. The early extra parliamentary campaign for workers' rights. The whole history of Tolpuddle martyrs cannot be ignored, rooted in non-conformity. You've got human rights traced back to the religious concerns of the Diggers or the Levellers. You can go back to new liberalism, and sort of Edwardian new liberalism and pioneering social reforms, rooted again in non-conformity. You can also think about how political parties themselves were created through sort of religious movements. Again, non-conformity in the 1870s and 1880s was seen as the conscience of the Liberal Party. The leading non-conformist paper, the Nonconformist and Independent, proclaimed the Liberal Party as the party of Christ. And the formulation of the Labour Party cannot be understood without the application of understanding of what historians called in the late 19th century the era of the religion of socialism, a story of sort of Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, Quakers, Unitarians, alongside wider spiritual movements and churches like the Ethical Church, the Labour Church, the Fellowship of the New Life, all these spiritual movements demanding radical social change given the indignities intrinsic to late 19th century capitalism. If you think of the first 5 leaders of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie embraced early evangelical Christianity, temperance, later joined the Congregationalist Church. 3-time Labour leader Arthur Henderson was a lifelong Wesleyan lay preacher. George Barnes attended the largest Baptist church, the largest nonconformist church in the country. Ramsay MacDonald was steeped in Calvinism, later became a Unitarian, occasionally attending Baptist Quaker services. William Adamson, a devout Baptist. You can move to the more present day and look at the Congregationalist background of Harold Wilson or the Baptist background of Jim Callaghan. You see this sort of drumbeat within Labour history about dissenting Protestant traditions forging the Labour Party and its moral and ethical purpose. It owes more to Methodism than Marxism, you know, that sort of drumbeat within history. And I find that really interesting way of curating Labour history, because it sort of has a bigger mission, which is the Catholic contribution to that history, which has never really been linked out, actually. And reasons why that's a sort of neglected part of Labour history is usually about the Irish question, Irish nationalism, the politics of Home Rule leading up to 1922, and the preference for the Liberals, the instructions of the clergy and traditional suspicions of socialism, the opposition to the Labour Party over issues of Catholic education, the product of a restricted franchise in terms of limited Catholic parliamentary participation. You see a whole series of reasons within Labour history about the neglected role conflicts in Labour history. Now, if you fast forward to today again, new Pope chose the name Leo last year, quite consciously rooting himself within a traditional Catholic social justice that is anchored around a Catholic encyclical of 1891 called Rerum Novarum. It was issued by Pope Leo XIII. This is 9 years before the Representation Committee was established in 1900. Advocates strong unions, the advance of collective bargaining, a living wage, a moral imperative to regulate capitalism. Respect for the dignity of labour became a cornerstone of Catholic political and theological activity. The very term social justice can be traced back to mid-19th century Jesuit theological arguments. But its actual origins, this encyclical lie closer to home. Cardinal Henry Newman was the leading clerical Catholic of its day, was a figure acknowledged by figures like Ben Tillett and Tom Mann as the person who helped deliver the Dockers' victory in East London in 1889, what was called the Cardinal's Peace. An extraordinary development in terms of the first real success of unorganised or unskilled working class organisation across a sector, the docks of East London. There was a very famous march to Hyde Park the day after the strike was resolved. And at the front, there were numerous crosses signifying the contribution of the Catholic leadership to resolve this signature victory in Labour history. But 15 years earlier, Manning had written a speech called The Dignity and Rights of Labour, which began, "I claim for Labour all the rights of property," and argued for the right to strike, picket and organise at a time when striking and picketing were criminal offences which carried sentences of hard labour. The reason why I raise that is that this is a sort of neglected story within Labour history, but the influence of this encyclical and this contribution and Manning's role figured in the role of figures like Peter Curran, the general organiser of the Gas Workers Union, Tom McCarthy, general organiser of the Dockers Union, James Sexton, who became the general secretary of the Liverpool Dockers. It flourished in the new unionism of the late 19th century, but remains an omission with Labour history. And then if you fast forward to the first Labour government, two standout figures in this overall historic story of the Catholic contribution to Labour history are first J.R. Clines, who was seen as one of the big five in that first Labour government, born in 1869, one of 7 Irish immigrant family. Father Patrick was a tenant farmer who left after the famine in 1851. 1883, he began attending public meetings, mainly about Irish issues, listening to nationalist and home rule speakers. His politicisation increased in the aftermath of the 1887 Bloody Sunday clashes in Trafalgar Square between police and marchers campaigning for the rights of the unemployed, as well as the Irish national question, given coercion legislation in Parliament. Later was a founder member of the ILP and the Labour Party, was in Farringdon Street in 1900, was deputy leader from 1918 to 1921, leader in 1921 to 22, including at the 22 election, which was arguably the great breakthrough election in many respects, where Labour rose from 57 to 142 seats, member of the wartime coalition of Lord George, in both of the minority Labour cabinets, president of the GMWU for 25 years, on Labour's NEC for 35 years, Labour MP for 37 years. There's been 22 Labour leaders in its history. Only one Catholic leader, and that's Clines. And he's a neglected figure in the whole of Labour history. And I find that really interesting, given this orthodox reading of Labour history, which is this driven by dissident Protestant traditions. One of the great counterintuitive arguments in Labour history might be Clines was still the leader until MacDonald came back into Parliament in 22. There was a vote for the leadership, which Clines lost 61 to 56 to become party chair, in effect party leader. A number of Clines supporters are not there. They were on trade union business, assuming that he would be victorious. And one of the what do you call those stories when they're counterfactuals? Factuals is if Clines had beaten MacDonald back, what might have happened? Because subsequently he was one of the people who opposed MacDonald in 1931. And the other figure is John Wheatley, born in Waterford in 1876. Biographies of the early 1900s about Glasgow politics. So the intense debates within the Catholic working class communities linked to this Catholic encyclical, the relationship between socialism, the communists, and Wheatley was at the centre and was denounced from the pulpit, especially once elected onto the council, and became the founder of the Catholic Socialist Society, which later affiliated to the ALP. The point I'm making, Philip, is quite a simple one, that you can look through the first Labour government through the lens of a sort of underrepresented the history around the Catholic contribution both to that government, but the prehistory of the party and the early tussles around the class composition of Labour politics.
Thank you very much indeed.
My minutes on to the end.
And then just
Yeah.
Excuse me, Chair, please can the speakers say their name before they start, because we don't all.
yeah, I introduced them at the beginning.
Yeah,
So right, so this is Peter Ackers.
So Peter Ackers, yeah, you kind of stole my clothes there a little bit, because my heading was the neglected influence of Protestant nonconformity. Or what I call Christian Labourism. And I think the interesting thing about Labour history, as it's written, often by secular left-wing, is not so much they neglect Catholics, they neglect Christians. There's a large strand of Labour history, including people like Eric Hobsbawm and stuff. And they'll write about Christians in the 19th century, but they don't want Christians in the 20th century. Because in the 20th century, everyone becomes a secular materialist socialist. So that's my general sort of prejudice here. So what I'm talking about is what I would argue is the central influence in this period, certainly at the time of this government, is the Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist. For instance, my PhD was on Wigan, and in Wigan, the Catholics were the second biggest group, in the 1851 census already. But it's the government, the Labour MPs in Wigan in the interwar periods were all Congregational. So it's quite an interesting story. Now, what I'm going to argue really is that Protestant nonconformity, and particularly a sort of radical version of liberalism, was central, and this was rooted in the democratic nonconformist chapel. So this is not your Anglican church, it's not your Catholic church, this is not your Lutheran church, churches that are dominated by a hierarchy. These are churches where ordinary people run their own chapels, and those chapels then become the basis for developing temperance organisations, friendly organisations, trade unions and stuff. And I see this as a very important part of it. And this is nicely covered in your book. You talk about MacDonald saying, "I am a good Presbyterian." I spoke at a Unitarian chapel recently, and they told me that actually was a Unitarian, but most English Presbyterians became Unitarians in the late 18th century. But that both may be true. Henderson is a Wesleyan Methodist, official for the Iron Founders Union. Snowden's also from a Wesleyan Methodist background, as you said. Hardy's from an Evangelical Union Congregationalist background. I think what these people have in common, and I think they have more in common than the denominational differences. What they have in common is strong sense of individual and collective self-help. They're autodidacts, so I'm just reading Henderson's biography here, and he leaves school at 12. So they're self-taught, they're moderate, so they don't like class conflict, they don't like violence, they're constitutional, and all these are key values which I think you see in that 1924 government. I think the interesting thing about this is that I suppose the question I would ask about the 1924 government and the 1929 government is that they're the first, but are they the last instances of governments led by working class people? And I think they may be. And there seems to me, the interesting thing here, Catterall's wrote a really interesting book on religion and the Labour movement in 2016. And 44% of interwar Labour MPs were nonconformists. So nearly half of all the interwar Labour MPs were nonconformists. In 1918, 66% were nonconformists. So they're a very, very powerful group in the Labour Party. Now you contrast this with the other side, which is the sort of socialist intelligentsia. And, what does Lenin say? Lenin says, well, there's the limitations of trade union consciousness. What you need is a middle-class socialist vanguard to tell the working class what to do. What do the webs say? The webs say what you need is professional experts and state planning to tell the working class what to do. And so I have a sense of loss at this period, a sense that an indigenous, liberal, democratic, Christian, associational social philosophy, which is based around unions, cooperatives, friendly societies, a sort of civil society idea was sort of lost in the 1930s and 40s. So in a sense, I'm a slightly skeptic. And I've got a quote here from one of the guys. Robert Moore wrote a very interesting book about primitive Methodists in the northern coalfields, northeastern coalfields, where they were the dominant force really in the Labour movement. It says the earliest MPs were not jolly friar types. They were local preachers, teetotalers and working class intellectuals. Even if they found them personally uncongenial, the local voters pitched out of the pubs and clubs to vote for them because they recognised the merits of orderliness, honesty and intellectual self-discipline in their representatives. So that's a big part of the story. I think there's something else that I'm trying to develop, which is that there's also a different type of vision of society coming out, which I would call broadly communitarian vision of society. And Alistair Reid and myself did an edited book called Alternatives to State Socialism a few years ago. And we tried to develop this argument that there are other ways of looking at Labour movement politics than just state socialism. And in a sense, there's an interesting debate about this sort of Christian Labourism of people like Arthur Henderson and stuff like that. Was it a dead end, that had run out of steam, or was it a missed opportunity? And I just got a couple of quotes here. There's Eric Hobsbawm. And to be fair to Eric Hobsbawm, he does actually look at the Labour sects. He does look at the primitive rebels and stuff like that. But even so, he says basically popular faith had no social philosophy. It was also totally untheological, unintellectual and emotional. It's characteristic of the working class sects that they were designed for the uneducated, so that passion and morality in which the most ignorant can compete on equal terms were the exclusive criterion faith of salvation. It's a sort of incredibly damning view of this working class culture. Ross McKibbon's has written a lot about Henderson in particular, but he describes the year 1931 also represented the failure of the autodidact tradition in British politics. The failure was also ideological. So the idea that this was the end of the road. Now my feeling is that a lot of the characteristics of that era that was represented by people like Henderson actually had a lot more mileage in them than we give them credit. And we actually lost quite a lot.
Thank you very much.
My name is Gill Bennett, and as Philip indicated, I've had an extremely long career, 50 years really, working as a historian in government. And my own work on the first Labour government, and indeed to some extent on later Labour governments, has principally been concerned entirely different with intelligence, secret intelligence, both British and indeed Russian. And we can talk about that in discussion. But I agree entirely with everything that David said about the government, the first Labour. I think it has had a poor press, and undeservedly in some respects. But there's no doubt that government was beset by problems that included party divisions, relations between the government and the British security services, and hostile activities on the part of Soviet Russia, despite the fact that one of the first acts of the government was to recognise the Soviet regime. And some of these problems persist into later Labour governments, and indeed, of course, Russian hostile activities are with us as we sit here tonight. What I want to just talk about briefly is what I see as shared characteristics of all three: the Labour Party, the security services, and the Bolshevik regime. And these three characteristics are: one, they were all very young in 1924. The second, each had, the First World War had had a profound effect on each. And the third is that as a result of both the first two things, each was struggling in 1924 to find its role in the post-war world. So I'm just going to leap through these quickly. The Labour Party and the security services were both turn of the century creations. The party formed formally in 1900 and, of course, as has been said, grew quickly and by 1924 had replaced the Liberals as the principal opposition, which is a remarkable achievement. The British Domestic Intelligence Agency, MI5, or Security Service, and its overseas counterpart, the Secret Intelligence Service, much later called MI6, were both established when the Secret Service Bureau was created in 1909 in anticipation of a war in which each would expand enormously. Now, in Russia, although the roots of the Bolshevik regime go far back, the leaders had returned from long periods of exile to seize power in November 1917, when one of Lenin's first moves was to establish the Cheka, then the name for the Security Intelligence Services. I'm not going to go into all the names because they go on and on and on. It's not, you know what I mean. But that security apparatus was based on earlier Tsarist structures and already well developed, covering both internal security in Russia and mechanisms for overseas espionage and subversion to further Bolshevik ideological mission to spread global revolution. And the Russians absolutely did not think that the first Labour government was a working class government. They regarded it as irretrievably bourgeois. Now, moving on to the second point, for all three elements, Labour Party, security services, Russia, the First World War was a very disruptive but also a catalytic experience. Now, of course, the Labour Party was divided about the First World War generally, and MacDonald resigning over the issue, yet returning as leader in 1922. Civilian intelligence agencies, co-opted by the military during the war, grew very rapidly in numbers, in experience and expertise, developing new techniques that were extremely valuable 20 years later. But there was considerable friction with the military and rows at the end of the war over who was going to pay for what. Nothing new there. The Bolshevik regime, of course, inherited the war, as it were, and though they soon signed a peace treaty with Germany, that kind of put them on the wrong side from a certain point of view in terms of the Allies, but it did create the basis for a secretly growing post-war Soviet-German relationship, which was significant. And of course, for Russia, the war didn't really end in 1918 with Allied intervention, territorial disputes, and of course, continuing struggle between red and white Russians. It meant that Russia ended the First World War isolated, paranoid, needing money that could only come from international engagement. My final point, they're seeking a role. So after the First World War, all three, party, security services, Russia, were struggling to stabilise, to obtain the resources and support they needed to secure their first future path. Both the party and the security service struggled to work out how they could best fulfil their mission that they'd been created for. In the straitened financial condition of Britain after the war, they struggled for resources, particularly short of human resource, good people. As David spoke about the formation of the government, it was very difficult, although they didn't make good, but it was very difficult for them to find ministerial candidates. And of course, MacDonald, crucially, ended up serving as Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, which had all kinds of implications. And they needed good people in the security services too. And after the war, most people in the services, a lot of whom had been in the military, went back to civilian life and they left. So you were really struggling on both sides. It was a recipe for friction And of course, you have to remember that the security service was regarded by Labour, certainly, but not only by Labour, as the tools of a small c conservative establishment, a perception fuelled then and later by a press that was largely under right-wing control. Profound distrust of many Labour politicians of what they called the establishment, which included the British civil service, the military, and of course the security establishment, result ministerial suspicion and distrust, even though they developed, as other Labour governments did, a perfectly good working day-to-day relationship. As for the agencies themselves, now complemented by the third arm of the secret state, the Government Code and Cyber School, formed in 1919, despite their rapid growth and significant operational achievements in the war, they were cut back drastically. The first, but not the last example of governments seeking a peace dividend. Monitored by the Secret Service Committee, the agencies were mired in political and administrative infighting while facing an increasingly hostile overseas landscape. And like the rest of, for everybody, including the security services, a Labour government was a completely unknown quantity. They didn't know how to deal with them. They didn't know how they would behave. And of course, they faced considerable ministerial suspicion. So January 24 was a critical period in Russia as well. The Union of Socialist Republics, the USSR, with Russia at the centre, formed in 1923. And when the Labour government took office in January, a few days after Lenin had died, even though Lenin had actually been incapacitated by a stroke for quite a while, but Stalin at that point is already on his way to establishing a stranglehold on the Soviet political system, but he wasn't there yet. And the Soviet Union had to embark upon a dual-track foreign policy, which continues in some respects to this day. Deep suspicion of and antipathy towards those powers perceived as failing to accord Russia equality as a great power and proper respect. Any of this sound familiar? Yet with a desperate need to participate in the global economic and commercial mechanisms they profess to despise. So I don't have to spell out the continuities. It's quite clear that what resonated in later Labour governments and continues to resonate today. But we can talk about all these things, but I just wanted to highlight that particular aspect of the 1924 government.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you want to?
Yep.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Our question, was it really the most working class government? MacDonald was at pains to show the opposite with such a tiny minority. Sure, most MPs then had working class and union background, but he was careful to appoint ministers from wider party backgrounds and class backgrounds. Only Jimmy Thomas, and Margaret Bonfield were from the TUC. Henderson, Clines and Shaw were there as leading party people. There was just a handful of ministerial appointments from the union, Harry Gosling and Manny Shinwell, as well as a few junior positions, Margaret Bonfield and Hodges. But nor could it be said that the measures carried reflected the union's input to the Labour manifesto. Nationalisation of the mines and railways would have been at the top of their list, but they were not considered, as they knew that the Liberals would never support them. Yet, by not frightening the horses and appointing establishment figures such as Lord Haldane, a former Liberal minister, MacDonald calmed the fears of the King, which was quite an important player, the middle and upper classes, that a revolution wasn't going to occur. We were reassured that Labour would govern effectively in that worldwide empire and were prepared to try the Labour experiment. I suppose its main achievement was to form a Labour cabinet and government, the first in British history. Organised Labour, the 200 unions and the TUC, the other wing of the Labour movement, approved Labour's decision to take government office, but they were not greatly involved in it by MacDonald. The National Joint Council was set up, which had been set up to consult the unions in 1921, was never used. Only one leader of the General Council, Thomas, from the NUR, was invited to join the government. Bonfield, that year's chair of the General Council, agreed to be a junior minister at Sidney Webb's suggestion. Neither Fred Bramley nor the TUC General Secretary nor Alf Purcell, the new chair of the General Council, appeared to have been consulted at all. The TUC were not yet a force that they would become. It was remarkable. The TUC did welcome the few radical measures introduced, especially the Housing Act and other smaller pieces of social insurance benefit legislation. Alf Purcell, in his presidential address to the TUC Congress in Hull that September, praised that achievement, and especially their recognition of and trade negotiation with the Soviet Union. But the TUC delegates at Hull really appreciated the address of a prominent member of the Russian trade delegation, Mikhail Tomsky, who was the president of the Russian unions, who happened to be also on the trade delegation. And he was also Communist Party Politburo member. Tomsky slated the recent Dawes plan, which MacDonald had just negotiated to resolve, which has been referred to as their international success, to resolve the Ruhr invasion crisis between France and Germany. Purcell had also been critical of that plan. The Congress then supported a resolution condemning the major Labour government's achievement, the Dawes plan. MacDonald was not invited to explain the Dawes agreement, which had been widely passed. This reception gives a clue to the deeper mood of the union leadership and activists at the time. For the first time ever, the affiliated unions overwhelmingly empowered the TUC to coordinate industrial actions of individual unions. It was this decision which validated the TUC involvement with the union's Red Friday victory in 1925 and the general strike of May 1926. Bramley and Purcell were also off to the Soviet Union that December at Tomsky's request. It was part of an extraordinary mission to merge the Russian communist-led unions with the Amsterdam Social Democratic-led International Federation of Trade Unions. In Moscow, they set up an Anglo-Russian joint advisory committee to press the merger case on a very reluctant, if to counsel, European unions. This showed why the left-led TUC, unengaged by the Labour government, were more interested in industrial and international affairs than the government. Further evidence for this was that in the Commons, Purcell, who was himself a recent Coventry MP, with other left-wing Labour MPs, they intervened to help the stalled Anglo-Russian trade negotiations out of a deadlock, but it caused the political balloon to go up. The then combined majority opposition and press damned the treaties just agreed by the cabinet as fake, in Lloyd George's term, and overgenerous to the Soviet Union, which they claimed was due to the trade union and communist influence of people like Purcell. They would bring down the government on this and other Red Scare, the Campbell case, and the Zinoviev Letter, of course, pretexts, as other speakers have explained. That was the union dimension.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. Tom Wilson. And Steve Mayog. I worked for about 5 different unions, including the TUC. I've done loads of different jobs, including being a negotiator and working with trade unions and Labour Party people. So what I want to talk about tonight is the relationship between the trade unions on the one hand and the Labour Party on the other. And I think there are all sorts of lessons that can be drawn from this government. But let me begin with my own brief experience, because it might help to explain why I think this is important. Adds a bit of colour anyway. Back in when I was about 32, back in the late 80s, you can work it out. I applied for and got a job of being the trade union liaison officer for the Labour Party. The first time they'd ever had such a thing. But I went along and got the job and was very, very interested in it. And so I went to the General Secretary and said, okay, what's the director like? director of the Labour Party. He said, what would you like me to do? And he said, well, not entirely sure, really. Why don't you go around and ask the unions, see what they want? So I did. And I met a whole range of responses: bafflement, amusement, the general kind of, oh, well, it's good the Labour Party is doing something, but, you know, so what are you going to do, son? You know, and quite often I'd meet with people who were kind of very warm and I mean, I remember going to Cozy, those who remember, became part of Unison, who had a very, very nice political director, Margaret Wheeler, who became political director for Unison. And she was delighted that I'd come along and all the rest of it. And she said, well, if you come up with some ideas, I'll see what we can do. And at the time, the Labour Party was in the throes of accepting the statutory minimum wage legislation as a commitment to the manifesto, which is a big deal. Lots of unions had campaigned strongly for it, including Cozy. So I went to one Peter Mann's, then director, and said, any chance we could figure this in the upcoming 87 campaign? Some of the trade union members might be particularly interested in this. And he was horrified and said, no, we don't want to talk about unions much at all, because unions are seen, and he was quite right, all the opinion polling showed that unions were seen, broadly speaking, as not a positive factor in why people might think about voting Labour. So I went to Rodney Bickerstaff with all the bravura of stupidity and youth and said, any chance you could print a few leaflets? And he said, how many do you want? I said, 500,000, actually. Whether it was 500,000 or 1 million, but he said, yeah, sure. So those were published and printed and distributed via, not me, but Trade Unions for a Labour Victory, Tuffle. Anybody remember Tuffle? And whether they did any good or not, I don't know, but they were duly distributed all around the country, and Peter Mandelson never spoke to me again. But the point of the story is how kind of weird that this tremendously important relationship, which ever since that famous first government had been such a powerful factor in the success or otherwise of Labour governments, didn't really seem to have any kind of sort of substance to it. And tracking it forward from 24 onwards, because I got interested in the history of all this, it became clear that there was a number of reasons for this. Firstly, it's already there. It's in the constitution of the Labour Party. There are trade union elected people on the NEP. That's quite unusual. I think it's almost unique around the world in socialist organisations. Sweden, I think, has something a bit like that. I'm not too sure. That's the first problem. Second problem, some unions are affiliated to the Labour Party and some are not. These days, it's down to about 11. It's representing a bit less than half of the entire trade union membership. So there's no way the TUC, representing all of the trade unions, all four, can possibly speak on behalf of the non-affiliated ones to the Labour Party. Or if it does do, it does so under a very different aegis. Third problem. An awful lot of the unions and Labour Party senior people, prime minister downwards, valued enormously their own personal relationships with trade union leaders, and they tended to have sort of the chosen few who they got on with. And this was true on the union side as much as on the Labour Party side. And they couldn't understand why that wouldn't work, why that was not enough. And if you got on with lots of people, that was great. And wasn't that what happened in Germany, for example, where there was the famous co-determination? And actually, it's not what happens in Germany at all. There's a formal elected system to get people on the boards of corporations that have a two-tier system. It does not feed through in any way into union seats on German governments, any more than it would in the UK. Having said all that, there have been attempts over the years to develop some kind of mechanism that would strengthen and formalise the relationship between the trade unions and the parliament. So after the debacle of the 24 government, when Ernie Bevan's failure to pull back the strike in the docks and the buses was kind of a large part, I would say, of why that Labour government lost public support. Because if the Labour government can't even call on one of its prominent members to manage what's massively disruptive, if they can't control the unions in some way, why would they bother to vote for them? And there was a strong view that amongst people who would vote for a Labour government for that reason, because they think they can manage the unions, this was a terribly destructive and divisive thing. Bevin refused to accept it. It's interesting to then look at Bevin's later career, where he ends up in the wartime cabinet and is a very, very strong advocate of Churchill's policy, which was to control and manage the unions in order to maximise the war effort, and was a founder member of NATO, and all those sorts of things. So partly learning the lessons of that 24 government. Citrine set up in the early 30s. And it's interesting that it was Citrine who set it up in the TUC. What kind of became the National Joint Council for Labour. And that continued to exist in various forms all through the 40s and 50s and 60s. By the 70s, you then have the Trade Union Liaison Committee. I'm skating over vast areas of history. There's lots of intermediate stages where these sorts of organisations had more or less power. Well, certainly what Citrine set up in the 30s had become quite a powerful and important framework within which to manage that relationship by the late 30s. And indeed, you could argue, I think, helped to position the unions on the party as being able to play their part in the wartime coalition. After the war, things became quite tricky, I think, on the trade union side, because that was the explosive growth in unions. There were 200 unions in the early 50s. Some of them affiliated to the Labour Party, some not. All of them within the aegis of the TUC. And trying to manage the relationships between those unions was hard enough, let alone to manage the relationship between all of those unions and the Labour Party. Fast forward through the 60s and the Donovan Commission, and yet another attempt to kind of put some sort of legal framework around that relationship, and into the 70s, where again there's the Trade Union Liaison Committee, which has some sort of role and some sort of power, but it's not terribly clear what it will do. And certainly it didn't help manage the winter of discontent and the collapse of that Labour government. And then the 80s, when Bennett et al. Basically set up the policy-making machinery, the National Policy Forum and everything that goes with it, which is still with us today, and is an important and powerful part of the apparatus. But any attempt to relaunch or strengthen the previous Labour Party Liaison Committee would be greeted with complete horror. Certainly on the Labour side, probably quite a lot on the union side too, frankly. And yet I would argue that if you look at every single Labour government, the failure to effectively manage in a positive way the relationship between the unions and the party has been quite a big part of their destructive effect, willingly or not, which I think is a terrible shame and a great missed opportunity. Now, I haven't got any great ideas about what form that relationship should take, but I do think that if we talked more about what the relationship might look like and how people might then operate differently within a relationship like that, you might begin to develop a more mature and considered idea about what an effective role for the unions there could be in Labour governments, which would mean that if, for example, take a current example, Wes Streeting decides he wants to explore different ways of not privatising, but bringing money into the NHS, you might be able to do that through the aegis of some sort of common framework with the NHS unions, which would mean that it was certainly a better informed and a richer discussion, and you'd be starting from a basis of having some sort of common shared objectives, even if you might not agree on everything. And the difficulty of not having some sort of framework to do that means that everything is then portrayed through the media as being about Wes Streeting this, Wes Streeting that, which I don't think he wants any more than anybody else. And certainly doesn't help to develop kind of mature, effective policy making across the whole range of the NHS and all the different unions in the NHS. So I'll stop there because I've probably said far too much already.
It speaks remarkably well to time. So we've got a good 25 minutes for questions before we wind up. So the floor is now open. Maybe you could, if you wish to do so, introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'm Jan White, I was Jan Drucker in Labour history days. I wanted to ask a question about suffrage, women's suffrage, and the relatively recent prior to the 1924 Labour government. And I just wondered, I mean, there was Margaret Bonfield, and I don't think there were any other women in the cabinet. What role did the advent of women's suffrage, albeit very, you know, on a limited basis, because she got done later, what role did that have in influencing the 24 government? Did it have any? Was it of any importance at all? Or was it of any importance in changing thinking, changing culture within the Labour movement at that time? I'd like to know the speakers for that comment.
Sure, I think it did in a modest way, and as you alluded to, there wasn't full franchise hadn't been extended fully. That doesn't happen until 1928. The manifesto in 23 and again in 24 they now read slightly condescendingly, but specific sections on the female vote. So they were undoubtedly conscious of that expanded electorate. And although I don't do any number crunching in the book, I think my impression was that a big chunk of those enfranchised voters, although I suppose the class element would have been quite weak given the qualification, may have voted Labour for the first time, and there was an understanding that they had to target them. Bonfield's appointment, she wasn't in the cabinet, she was a junior minister. I think there was an interesting tussle over whether or not she would have cabinet rank, which of course she has in the second Labour government. There was a definite, that was a deliberate move. It wasn't incidental that she was a member of that government. It was a big thing that you had a female minister for the first time. Her record is a bit mixed from that government, but she survives in 29. There are also tensions. Religion has been discussed. John Wheatley was a very staunch Catholic. The birth control movement was strong in this period. There was an expectation that the Labour government would move on that. Wheatley had other ideas. He was completely opposed to any compromise, and that caused some tension within the movement. But yes, they were aware of it. They campaigned accordingly, and within the context of the time, in quite a sophisticated way. I think they targeted the female vote, so to speak.
Anyone else like to come in? Just very briefly say that I think that broadly speaking, the unions were further ahead on issues around women's suffrage than the Labour Party was in, say, the 80s and early 90s. That then changed, I think. But my argument would be that had there been a stronger framework to bring together the two wings of the party and to discuss and explore the issues there, then maybe the Labour Party would have been a bit quicker to pick up some of those issues. Thank you for this.
I think the unions were obviously very male dominated at the time, and they would not have been top of their priority list, even though they had quite a large number of members. And of course also the votes, the increased vote for Labour in 24, November 24, a lot of them were the women that were actually enfranchised, and certainly afterwards, when it came in 29, when most women had the vote. I think 1930 was the final, and that would have shown too. But there wasn't any serious discussion of policy about women.
More questions? Yeah, please.
My name is Rosamond Mycura. Regarding Labour's interest in internationalism and specifically in the USSR, what was it about Russia in that year, 1924, a year of transition between Lenin and Stalin, that made this Labour government in 1924 want to engage? And also there was a parliamentary visit in 1925 to Soviet Russia, which David Rees-Grenfell was on. He was a trade unionist MP that got elected first in 2022. Was that parliamentary visit to Soviet Russia a hangover, or was it still the following government wanted to agree to it and that's why it went ahead?
Well, I think on the policy towards Russia, MacDonald felt that, I mean, there was obviously internationally a problem with dealing with a regime whose avowed intention is to overthrow democratic governments, but there was also a strong view that you needed to try and get them on side. If you could, it would be better to work with them. And there's two aspects to this. One is MacDonald believing it was good policy and that you had a chance of actually mitigating Soviet hostility. But of course, there were a lot of members of the Labour Party who did regard Soviet Russia fraternally. They did not necessarily communists, but they thought that these are brothers, and they did not like an anti-Soviet policy. So I mean, the Labour government took a certain amount of pride in being the first Western country to accord de jure recognition to the Soviet Union. But there was pressure on the other side too, because despite the communist plan, the Bolshevik plan to spread universal revolution, as I mentioned in my remarks, they needed money, they needed trade, they wanted a loan, they needed international engagement in order to try and put the Soviet economy onto a sound footing. So it was in both their interests, technically. It proved, of course, extremely difficult, and it was a political gift there to Labour's opponents when it all started to go rather pear-shaped, because what the Soviet Union really wanted was a loan, and actually it was very unlikely that the government would ever have got the loan through the House of Commons. But engagement doesn't finish, because in 1924, I mean, Labour continues to have strong links with the Soviet Union, and of course the trade union movement did, and there's a trade union delegation that goes to Russia to investigate the authenticity of the Zinoviev Letter. That's a bit later on. But yes, a parliamentary delegation, it wasn't, you know, the Conservative government also believed to some extent that engagement is better than hostility, and there has to try and be a way of working with. I mean, there's always, I mean, and there still are throughout the world arguments about when you've got a rogue regime, is it better to try and get it to play nicely, or do you shut it out? And that was true for the government, the Conservative government that followed the Labour government as well.
Could I also add? I mean, there's no doubt that the feeling in the country was pro-Russia, pro-revolution.
Some parts of it.
Well, most parts of it.
Really?
In terms of the actual issue was unemployment. It was seen that trade with Russia would actually be beneficial to the economy here, and it was on that basis that the TUC certainly.
Yes, though I think a lot of that was Russian propaganda.
But you equally had a very strong anti-Russia, starting with Churchill, who proudly boasted he would strangle Bolshevism in the cradle, and he worked on, as did indeed a lot of the conservatives. They had been involved in the huge intervention in Russia. They had torn the country apart practically with the whites. So there's no doubt that there was a mixed bag here. Some were for, but by and large, I think, I mean, the Labour manifesto did promise to restore relations with the Soviet Union, and that would have been what motivated MacDonald to do it. But a bit like Trump today, there was a lot of people thinking in Russia that they have all these minerals, they have all these resources, we could develop them. And the American capital poured into Russia, and factories, including Ford's. And so there was a mixed feeling about it in different sections of the community.
Yeah, I suppose it's related to this. I suppose if you're looking at, I mean, one of the problems with this particular era, particularly MacDonald as a character, is that he's been demonised. It's all about betrayal of socialism and all that stuff. And it seems to me it's worth saying that if you read, there's various books, David Reynolds, The Long Shadow, Andy Thorpe edited a book called The Failure of Political Extremism in Interwar Britain. One of the great achievements of this era from the British Labour movement was that we didn't have a strong communist movement and we didn't have a strong fascist movement. And I think most historians think that's quite a big achievement. And then coming up to Tom's point, it's quite interesting that if you read, say, Hugh Clegg's History of British Trade Unions, he's quite complimentary about the national governments in the 1930s, and Citroën and Bevin worked quite closely with them to develop a sort of early version of corporatism, if you like. And so I think there's a case for sort of restoring this period and looking at it in a sort of less polemical sort of way than people have done.
More questions?
Yeah, please.
I'm Robert, postgrad at Birmingham. Can I, picking up on the first speaker's mention of the manifestos back in the day, they were quite flimsy. So does the panel have any, can shed any light on what were voter expectations for a Labour government within traditional working class areas? Potentially their options were the Liberal Party or the Labour Party. So what were they? Was it a leap of faith, really, by voting Labour back in 1924?
I mean, it's difficult to say that. I mean, there wasn't opinion polling or opinion surveys of the sort you now take where it was down to. I think that starts with the 30s. And also, crucially, in the 1923 election, there is a swing to Labour, but it's not huge. You know, they don't do that. They don't really win the election. The Conservatives are still the largest party. It's just the numbers don't add up. So that's quite crucial, I think. There's not wild enthusiasm for a Labour government. That first administration emerges just from a complicated arithmetic in the Commons, the fact that the Tories and Liberals despise one another, because that would have been the obvious coalition from that. But of course, they'd had a coalition recently and it hadn't worked out. I mean, anecdotally, I think the expectation from working class voters would have been for progressive action where previous governments had failed. So I think there was an expectation around housing, that, you know, that'd been a long running issue, and Wheatley, to his immense credit, breaks a logjam there, and an expectation that, you know, welfare would be extended modestly and so on. And, you know, some of that is delivered. But Tom, I think, unless I misheard, Tom suggested that the government had lost support. I'm not sure that stacks up. I mean, they gained 1 million votes in the 1924 election. And again, despite the absence of opinion polling, certainly by July, August 1924, you look at diaries and contemporary news coverage, there was a perception that the government had gained support. And indeed, that spooks the Liberals, especially, and the Conservatives, so that by September, they resolved to basically end this experiment, because, you know, it's actually getting a bit dangerous, not in revolutionary terms, but dangerous because a Labour government is gaining credibility, popularity, currency, and the Liberals in particular want things to revert back to how they used to be. But of course, that doesn't work out.
Yeah, I accept that, but I think what I was trying to say is that effectively from that point onwards, when the trams and the buses didn't work and people couldn't get, there was a strong feeling against them. And you could argue that the fact that the Labour government was able to stand up to the strikers and manage the economy and get them back working, despite Berlin, would do its favour. But that was the point at which unions ceased to be an asset. They were no longer an asset, and they were seen as a liability. That was my point.
But also, there was a divergence between Labour and the unions, which culminated in the general strike of 19. In other words, there was a feeling on the union side that parliamentary action was a waste of time. It didn't deliver anything, and therefore industrial action was what counted. And so there was a movement, and particularly in 1925, when the Baldwin government had to concede to the miners another sort of bounty plus an inquiry as a result of the threat of industrial action by the transport workers and others, which would have brought the coal to a standstill. So there was this sort of divergence within the Labour movement as to what was best. And of course, after the general strike, they got their answer, which is that parliamentary action was most important, rather than just industrial action. So that was quite an important trend that was developing from 24.
John? Well, there's an interesting associated question to this, which David touched on in his early points, which is about the lack of preparation of the Labour Party for government.
Yes.
And there's a really interesting question about whether that was interlinked with their various philosophical associations. Webb called it the inevitability of gradualism. You know, this sense that history was unfolding, that socialism was so rational, it was self-evident going to unfold. And that was linked to certain religious movements, positivism, certain technological determinism. There was this whole different groups that came together which sensed that history was on our side, which abruptly changed after 51. But that was a hallmark of those early Labour movements. The question then is, does that act as a disincentive to do a lot of policy work if history's on your side? You know, and that was sort of rectified after. The same could be said against the 1929 Labour government, its lack of preparation and its sort of calamitous effects. And there was a sort of reckoning in the 30s, a lot of policy development which would never occurred before then. Maybe it got into power too early in that sense. Because of that
The same might be said of the current government.
I don't think that's because of their belief in the inevitability.
We must remember how bad the economic situation was in the early 20s in the country, and the shortage. I mean, so people would have been feeling that things were really, really bad. And yes, the government was certainly unprepared to come in. It was a shock to everybody, and ordinary voters didn't know what to expect from it. I mean, that's all clear. But there must have been a hope that a new kind of government would bring, and to some extent, you know, I mean, David talked about MacDonald's international work, and actually that was important because of the crisis to do with the failure, the difficulty of German reparations and so on, deliveries of steel, and I mean, we can't go into it all, but I mean, there was a definite need to reach an international settlement on economic, and he did manage to do that.
Yeah.
Is there a danger of talking about the working class as if they're a homogenous group? You know, I mean, large numbers of working class people, particularly in areas like Lancashire, voted Conservative and always did. In 1931, working class people overwhelmingly supported the national government. The TUs, I mean, the trade unions were not united in the support of things like the general strike. There were big divisions in the trade unions. I mean, the miners distorted the trade union politics as such a powerful force, and for a period they were very militant, and that changed the balance of it. But that didn't mean most trade unions agreed with the politics of the NUM. Oh, and there wasn't the NUM, Miners' Federation at that time. So I think we need a sort of more nuanced picture of what working class people were thinking in this time. Yeah.
We've got time for a couple of questions. Yeah, please.
So Paul O'Donnell from Birkbeck College. Just one sort of quick aside and then a question. The aside being, one of the reasons that that Labour put votes on in 24 was for the first time they actually stood a full slate of candidates across the country.
Sorry.
One of the reasons that Labour put votes on in 1924 was because for the first time they actually stood something approaching a full slate of candidates.
Sorry.
You've got that. But my question was about, and picking up something, one of the first things actually David said was about some of the recruits into Labour, into that Labour government. Both the people that were recruited like Haldane and Chelmsford and Parmore in 23-24, but also people like Josiah Wedgwood, Ponsonby, people who have come from the Liberals, 2.5 minutes earlier.
Trevelyan.
Yes, Trevelyan, who have come from the Liberals 2.5 minutes earlier. And is one of the reasons that those people are welcomed into the Labour Party because MacDonald and to some extent Henderson can see that they want to have this slightly broader, that they will have this broader appeal, that they're, that they're presenting to a middle class or a working class, parts of a working class electorate, that these are people that look like they are going to be in government, that look the part, that feel right, and to what extent is that a factor?
MacDonald wanted middle class votes. I mean, it's undeniable. If the Labour movement was to expand and the future Labour government was to have a majority, they couldn't rely purely on section of the electorate. So note that he was quite ostentatious about that, and that annoyed people deeply in some cases and caused friction. But MacDonald wasn't. That's the weird thing about MacDonald, is that the more I look into it, I've just finished a book on the general strike, and he was much criticised at the time on that. But actually, he was right. He got most of the big calls correct. It annoyed people intensely at the time. It's very difficult to argue in retrospect that he's mistaken in his analysis. And in electoral terms, in growing the Labour Party, it worked.
Can I just add one point to that? Because there is also, I think David Howell was writing about analysing 29 to 31, where he said, because he didn't have that class-rooted diagnosis, it was much more communitarian, which could easily slip into notions of the national interest, which got him into a bit of trouble later on in terms of his wider philosophical understanding of the direction of society and beyond the class dynamic there that easily blended into notions of the national interest, and we saw what happened with that.
Thank you. Roger, John.
Yeah, Roger Geary. I want to go back to the original concept of this evening's discussion, which is the fact that is this the most working class Labour government? Question posed. I'd like to hear what the panel, or how the panel would define working class. And if we're talking about the most working class, as Peter has just said, working class isn't stood still. It's not a homogeneous group of people you can define as one entity. So how do you make a comparison between 1924 and any other Labour government when it comes to defining working class?
Let's have a go.
I think one important point.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, one important distinction is between Labour and Communist. The Labour Party, the British Labour Party, were seen as a welcome non-communist force in the country. The King spent a lot of time with MacDonald, weekly discussions, and he persuaded quite a number of the senior people in the Tory party and the Liberal Party to give Labour a chance. Because they were worried, clearly, they were worried from what was happening, what was coming from Russia was revolution, not just in Russia, but throughout Europe. And there was a threat that would be brought about. So they saw Labour as worth a try, as an alternative, because there was a mood in the country for change. And Labour was seen that they would deliver constitutional change, that they would deliver, and MacDonald particularly was seen as a safe pair of hands, because he was quite philosophically thought through his socialism. He wasn't a communist. He didn't like the Bolsheviks, but he had aspirations to be a socialist. So I think that was part of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in this period, I mean, you're talking about manual working class. That was the original usage of the term. And clearly, I mean, I'm just rereading an old biography of Arthur Henderson, you know, left school at 12, you know, did an apprenticeship, became an official in the Iron Founders Union and stuff like that. I mean, predominantly skilled working class, I think a lot of these guys are. But they are, I mean, they are autodidacts. They're guys who've never been to school for very long. They've certainly not been to university or anything like that. And so in that sense, they are quite remarkable. And I suppose they're, in some ways, they're not something we can think of so much now, because they were from an era when there wasn't that much education available and stuff like that. But I've always thought that we should always say working classes. I don't, and unless you're using Marxist proletariat, I don't think there's such a thing as the working class. It's incredibly, if you read something like Richard Hoggart's book, Uses of Literacy, and he talks about the, you know, the road by road status divisions within the working classes, you know, and I don't think there was ever a homogenous work. I think you walk down Victorian streets in Britain looking at the houses, you can see what the different status things are.
To approach it from a slightly different perspective, was the first Labour government representative? I think it was strongly representative.
Yeah.
It had working class, middle class, faintly aristocratic elements. It had Liberals, Labour, a couple of Tories. The current cabinet, of course, took much pride in declaring that I think since the departure last year of forget who it was. They were all state educated, and that's great. Don't get me wrong, but actually, it's not representative. I mean, there should be at least one or two members of the cabinet who went to private school.
9.1%.
Well, I did, for a different project altogether, I did a tot up on the 1945, on the Attlee government, on the background and education of ministers. And I mean, it's not exact, and so don't call me out on it, but I found it was really quite equal between people like Bevin, Ernest Benevin, and indeed like Shimwell, who had really had very little formal educational, but had come up through the cooperative movement or all kinds of, that, or the trade union movement, and what you might call middle class socialists by conviction, and people like Cripps, for example, is entirely the other end of the scale. I mean, I don't say they were all best buddies, but my goodness, what an effective group they were as a government. And I would put my stall out that they were more working class in a certain sense, which is not the same thing as representative.
No. Well, we just to end with an advertisement. History and Policy has produced a series of podcasts called Leading Labour. They're actually produced by my colleague Izzy Khan, and the final episode on Corbyn was just released a few weeks ago, and it's a really fantastic series. And we launched it in the summer with a panel which included Neil Kinnock, and at one point Neil's talking about Keir Starmer boasting that his father was a toolmaker. Neil's line was, I said to him, lad, where I grew up, a toolmaker was aristocracy. So they're very great working class. We've got to 7 o'clock. It's been a fantastic discussion and really, really rich with so many different perspectives. So thank you all for coming. But let's finally thank our wonderful panel for their contribution.